From notorious serial killers to killers still yet to be identified, we're taking a look at some of the most evil monsters from the Lone Star State. The servant girl Annihilator, the Austin Axe Killer, the Midnight Assassin, these were all names given to one of the earliest serial killers in the United States, an unidentified assailant who terrorized Austin, Texas between 1884 and 1885, 3 years before Jack the Ripper. The killer would attack his victims while they slept in their beds, hacking them up with an axe. The majority of his victims were mainly black women. The spree only stopped when additional police were hired to patrol the streets at night and residents formed their own vigilance committee. In total, the servant girl Annihilator was responsible for 8 deaths. He also severely injured 6 other women and 2 men. But the killer was never caught or identified. There were all kinds of theories floating around at the time. Some local voodoo practitioners believed that he had the power of invisibility, because no dogs in the homes or surrounding areas where he'd attacked had barked. He seemed to just almost move entirely silently. And in 1888, after Jack the Ripper had killed Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, another theory came about that the Austin Axe Killer and Jack the Ripper were actually the same guy. Carl Eugene Watts isn't a name that usually comes up in the lists of the worst American serial killers in history, but he's actually one of the most prolific. Born in 1953 in Killeen, Texas, Watts began his spree in 1974. He'd kidnap his victims from their homes and torment them for prolonged periods before finally killing them, usually by strangulation, bludgeoning, or drowning. Most of his victims were young white women, who he described later in court as having, quote, evil eyes. He'd attack in different jurisdictions, often crossing into different states. He became known as the Sunday Morning Slasher and operated for about 8 years before finally being caught. Police weren't able to connect him to every killing he was suspected of carrying out, which could be over 100, but he did receive a life sentence, dying in prison of prostate cancer in 2007. On December 13, 1990, a lady of the night, Mary Lou Pratt, was found dead in the Oak Cliff neighborhood in Dallas. She'd been killed with a firearm. But the most disturbing part, both of her eyes had been carefully removed. Then just 2 months later, another woman of the night, Susan Peterson, was found dead just outside of Dallas. Once again, her eyes had been carefully surgically removed. There was obviously a pattern now, and the assailant became one of the most wanted criminals in the state. Finally, just 1 month later, a third woman was found dead, lying on her side near a school. Once again, no eyes. A major breakthrough in the case came when a woman tipped off the police about a man named Charles Frederick Albright, who was known to have a strange fascination with eyes, and he'd also known the first victim, Mary Lou Pratt. A number of other courtesans said that Albright had been violent with them, so this was enough to get a search warrant. In Albright's home, police found that he'd removed the eyes from several photographs and dolls. He also had a history with the law going back to when he was just a teenager, mostly for robbery. He was only ever tied to one of these killings officially, but it's pretty clear he was responsible for all 3. He was sentenced to life without parole and died in prison in 2020. Dean Corll, aka the Candy Man. He operated between 1970 and 1973, known to have killed a minimum of 28 young men in Houston and Pasadena. He'd lure his victims by offering them a ride, or he'd invite them to a party. Now, it's easy to say don't get into a car with a stranger, but the thing is, Corll would acquaint himself with a number of his victims before picking them up and taking them to his home, where he'd torment and kill them. And if he didn't know them himself, they'd be friends or acquaintances of his accomplices. Yeah, he didn't operate alone. He had 2 young men, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, helping him. Once his victims were in his home, he'd give them various substances until they'd pass out, then he'd handcuff them to his bed, have his way with them, or torment them until finally taking their lives. Sometimes this would be drawn out for days. Well, it finally came to an end when one of his accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley, grabbed Corll's firearm and turned it on him. Henley told him, "You've gone far enough, Dean. I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Corll began stepping towards Henley, daring him to shoot, not believing he would, but Henley did. Coral tried to run out of the room, but Henley fired 3 more times, killing him instantly. Good riddance. Genene Jones was a nurse who worked with young patients, and this makes her case incredibly disturbing because a nurse is just the last person you'd be expecting to intentionally cause you harm. She's believed to have caused the deaths of around 60 young patients between 1970 and 1982. She did this by administering unneeded substances like dioxin and heparin into her patients. She started her career at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, but people started getting suspicious when a larger than normal number of young patients were dying under her care. Now, instead of reporting her, the hospital just quietly kind of let her go to avoid bad publicity and potential lawsuits, which is insane. Then Jones found a job at a pediatrician's clinic in Kerrville. Luckily, her suspicious behavior didn't go unchecked there, though. A doctor discovered she had been accessing dangerous amounts of succinylmethonium chloride. Eventually, in 1985, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Joe Ball became known as the Butcher of Elmendorf and the Alligator Man. This case goes back to the 1930s in Texas. Joe Ball was a former soldier who turned to bootlegging after World War I and later opened a saloon when Prohibition ended. And behind his saloon, he kept a pond with 6 alligators, where he would sometimes feed them live cats and dogs for entertainment purposes. That's already evil on its own, but it seems it just wasn't satisfying Joe Ball's thirst for cruelty because things went even further. Women in the area, including his very own wife, began to disappear. In 1938, 2 county sheriffs came to question Ball about the missing women, and he panicked, ending his own life with a pistol. After Ball's death, his handyman Clifford Wheeler came forward and confessed to helping Ball dispose of the bodies of 2 women by feeding them to his alligators. It's suspected that Ball may have been responsible for the deaths of up to 20 women. Thank God this next guy was put to death. Anthony Allen Shore, a complete and utter sicko. He mainly operated in Houston, forcing himself on several young women and girls between 1986 and 1995. He would strangle his victims before dumping their bodies. He wasn't investigated until 1998 when he was convicted of harming his own 2 daughters. He was required to provide DNA to authorities who were then able to link him to victims of his then unsolved crimes. After 11 hours of interrogation, Shore had given authorities everything they needed. It took the jury less than an hour to decide to put Anthony Allen Shore to death, and in 2004, he was put down by lethal injection. Edward Harold Bell was born in 1939 in southern Texas. He was responsible for a long list of disturbing crimes, but most notably for having killed 11 girls throughout Houston, Galveston, Webster, and Dickinson between 1971 in 1977. He revealed these crimes in 1998 in a series of letters, which he sent to prosecutors in Galveston and Harris counties. The cases had been unsolved at the time, and the details Bell outlined matched the circumstances of the cases. The first killing Bell detailed took place in 1971. He killed 2 girls in Galveston, Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, dumping their remains close to a deserted bridge. The 2 had been reported missing after accepting a ride from a man in a white van. At the time, Bell had owned a white van. Bell was never convicted for any of the killings he detailed in these letters, but he was already in prison for having killed a Marine named Larry Dickens, who had been attempting to restrain him after having flashed several young women from inside his car. And it's worse than that, but I can't really go into details here, nor would I really want to. Now, he'd actually managed to escape this incident and was a wanted fugitive. He wasn't caught until an episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired about the case, and someone who knew Bell tipped off the police. Angel Resendez, aka the Railroad Killer, was on the FBI's most wanted fugitives list before finally surrendering to Texas authorities on July 13th of 1999. He carried out at least 23 killings while train hopping across the southern US and Mexico between 86 and 99. Resendez would hop on freight trains traveling from one place to another and would often target people living near railway tracks, He would break into homes or attack people he encountered, leaving just a trail of violence in his wake. And what made Resendez particularly dangerous was his ability to evade capture, because he was constantly moving and crossing state lines. Law enforcement agencies across different states really struggled to coordinate and apprehend him. And an extra creepy thing about him was that he liked getting to know his victims after killing them, usually looking at their driver's licenses and other forms of ID, and then taking sentimental items from their homes. He was a real creep. His reign of terror finally ended in 1999, and he died of lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas in 2006. The Phantom of Texarkana, the Phantom Killer, the Phantom Slayer. He has many monikers, but his real identity is still a complete mystery. The Phantom Killer stalked young couples in the Texarkana region between February 22nd and May 3rd of 1946. Each attack targeted young couples in isolated spots on weekend nights. The attacks occurred every 3 to 4 weeks. In the first attack on February 22nd, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were parked in a secluded area when a man wearing a white cloth mask approached them. He ordered them out of the car, hit Jimmy on the head with a firearm, and forced himself on Mary using the barrel of his firearm. Luckily, both Jimmy and Mary survived this attack. In the second attack on March 24th, Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found dead in Griffin's car. They'd been shot outside the car and then placed back inside. The third attack on April 14th involved Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. Martin was found shot multiple times. Booker was found shot twice, both with the same type of pistol used in the previous attack. The final attack on May 3rd resulted in the deaths of Virgil and Katie Starks in their home. Katie had actually taken 2 bullets to the face, but had managed to run out of the home and get help. That was the last attack, but not because the assailant was caught. For some reason, he just stopped. The case has never been solved. With all that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.